Yet. Thank you very much for being here. In particular, I'd like to thank the Senate of the Italian Republic for hosting us, as it has been doing for many years now. This is a United Nations Day, International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. This day was inaugurated in 2013 by the General Assembly of the United Nations to commemorate the violent death of two French newspapermen in Africa. In Ghislaine Dupont, 51, and Claude Vernon, 58. They were murdered in Mali. Today, I'd like to thank the representatives of our government, of AGICOM, the Council of Europe, the OSCE. We have very important guests today here. Guy Berger is our guest of honor. He manages the UNESCO Division for the Freedom of Expression in Paris. Guy Berger, I guess. And today we'll see what happened between October last year and today. We'll try and find out what happened in the era of freedom of the press, of threats and harassment of journalists, cases filed with no grounds at all. We will describe the situation, and mainly we'll try to put forward proposals mainly concerning our legislation, keeping into account what already exists in Italy, law and case law, and what happens in Europe concerning conventions, the European Treaty, and the case law of the Court of Justice and of the European Court for Human Rights, Luxembourg and Strasbourg. So more or less, this is what we're going to do today. We will start with a video to try and show the Italian paradox. And after that, we will start with our rapporteurs. Thank you.
In Italia abbiamo forse troppo spesso
In Italy, we have neglected the harassment and aggression to reporters. I would like to thank Ossigeno for its activity in providing us all the information and the data about these attempts to democracy, which are a source of concern. Based on the data of Ossigeno and based on annual reports between 2006 and 2014, 2,300 cases of violence and harassment to reporters have been registered. Approximately 18,000 such cases have been registered. It is therefore necessary to act upon all of this. This is a source of concern. We have approximately 30 colleagues in Italy who are under protection under police protection because of their activity of reporting. So there's a very large number of reporters who have been under harassment and aggression. Today, I think that we have to develop synergies in this context. We need to have a source of information, and even when this information is relates to hard truths, we have to carry out an in-depth analysis when it comes to information dissemination, also with regards to research in this context to try to provide a protection mechanism. I think in Italy, freedom is, information is free, but I do think that many reporters are not free when it comes to performing their activity. There are many obstacles to the expression of reporters' freedom of expression, and they also risk defamation with requests for damages. Freedom of expression means that we have to guarantee rights to reporters to the dissemination of information. People have
and other countries are now moving to ban speech which is not unlawful.
Media outlets, as well individual journalists, are too often the targets of threats, pressures, limitations, or even direct attacks by various interest groups, underworld figures, or political entities led by democratically elected leaders, and often confronted with more complex challenges and problems than in communist era.
Per prima cosa bisogna sapere veramente che cosa succede e bisogna raccoglierle attivamente le informazioni. E le informazioni non possono essere solo le informazioni ufficiali. Per raccogliere le informazioni c'è un metodo eccezionale che è il giornalismo. Il giornalismo può aiutare il giornalismo.
È emersa una contraddizione spaventosa. C'è stata una grande manifestazione per la libertà di informazione, ma oggi in Spagna si parla di lei Mordazza, di una legge restrittiva sul diritto di cronaca e sulla rete. Oggi la Francia si sta interrogando sul problema di un'ulteriore pressione e vigilanza sulla rete. Quindi l'Italia non è un'eccezione in questo caso. L'Italia sta dentro un fenomeno, ecco perché mi piace il progetto qui presentato, dentro un fenomeno che ha bisogno di una risposta europea e non di una risposta provinciale, paese per paese.
States, national governments, bear the responsibility for ensuring the safety of journalists and also for ensuring that investigations are prompt and effective. And the key words here are positive obligations.
La legge sulla diffamazione, così come è stata formulata ed è come è stata approvata dalla Camera, è uno specchietto per le allodole.
La legge che ha approvato la Camera è una legge spot, è una legge che serve al Parlamento per darsi una riverniciata.
And the OSCE representative invites the Italian Senate to carefully consider calls from many international bodies for the full decriminalization. There are also excessive fines that are anchored in the new law and which can have a chilling effect, as we heard before in other interventions, a chilling effect on freedom of the media that can in the end result in self-censorship by journalists and media actors.
I wish you well. I congratulate you, Ossigeno. I look forward to talking more concretely about how we can combine forces to, as I say, put the governments on the spot and make them fulfill their commitments. Thank you.
Ecco, questo era il 2015, la sala era la stessa e l'osservatorio di Ossigeno aveva calcolato che, soprattutto verificato, che i giornalisti minacciati in vario modo, intimiditi, erano 2.451, siamo a 3 anni fa. Adesso io do la parola al presidente di Ossigeno, Alberto Spampinato, qui alla mia sinistra, e cominciamo a vedere adesso, con il corso del dibattito, qual è la situazione e quali sono le proposte. Grazie.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everybody. This is the way we started last year. Last year, the video was longer and it showed slides telling us what had changed in the meantime. We will update you now. The change was that as of 2015, 1,200 journalists had been harassed, intimidated, threatened. These events had been certified by Ossigeno. Out of all the proposals that we had submitted, none had been implemented. Now, what has changed? Instead of 2,451 journalists, bloggers, reporters that had been threatened, are now 3,721. Ossigeno mentions them by name and specifies what happened to them. Severe violations of the freedom of the press, the freedom of expression, with threats, intimidations, harassment. These names were published and related facts certified. The libel legislation, which our parliament has been working on for the past legislature, is now stalling. It started stalling in early 2017, and now, of course, nobody's talking about it any longer. It started with very good intentions, but unfortunately, a lot of contradictions were in that law, and eventually that law would make things worse. And that's how we are standing now. In 2016, here in this room, we published official data on the trend in libel trials against the press. New data related to the enforcement of a law that our parliament has been changing for more or less 5 legislatures. Therefore, we made a lot of suggestions, we submitted a lot of proposals, and at a certain point in time we said, hey, we believe that this law leads to negative effects that have been measures on actual cases. Therefore, many journalists end up being sentenced to jail. If you think that the main problem that that law wanted to solve was eliminating jailing for libel crimes. We proposed even more than that. We proposed that this kind of libel should not be considered as a criminal event. And what we were told was, well, it doesn't really matter because actually journalists are never sent to jail. And we published a file showing that in actual fact, over 3 years, journalists had all in all been sentenced to 7 years of jail. So we asked Parliament, we challenged the government to provide official data. If you can say that we are liars, well, prove it. The Ministry of Justice accepted to then talk to us and looked for this kind of data. We found out that Parliament was not aware of this data, and the Ministry of Justice didn't even collect them. You know that the ministry collects all statistical data that every year are published and discussed by the presiding judge of the Court of Cassation every year at the start of the judicial year. Well, as a result, the government found out this data and authorized us to make them public. Now, I'll just give you a short summary because everything is published, and you can find this on our site, not on newspapers, because God knows why, but this official data of the government was never published. Every year, there are about 6,000 trials for libel by the press, criminal trials we're talking. And 90% of these end up with nothing. That is, the defendants are considered not guilty right after the investigative stage, and the remaining 20% are found not guilty during trial. This explains that many of these procedures are just groundless. And government data also state that 155 journalists are sentenced or found guilty every year in criminal trials, and they are sentenced to more or less 1 year of jail. This means that over 1 year, about 103 years of detention are sentenced. Therefore, in 3 years, this means 303 years plus 5,000 groundless trials. It's large figures. And maybe that's why nobody publishes them, but that's what actually happens in this country. And that's why also Parliament hasn't really been doing much recently. They maybe started, but we hope things will become a bit more intense. As I said, we have many important guests. We have Under-Secretary Primi and Under-Secretary Gaetti from the government, who will speak soon. My statement will be published, therefore I will try to summarize and just express the main concepts. So the essential data you've seen, and they concern Italy. But today we'd like to talk about a particular aspect of this story, which is impunity for crimes against journalists, media workers who are attacked just because they're doing their job. They go by the rules, they respect their interlocutors, as well as all the ethical duties of their job, which ask them to be loyal, true, and honest. How many journalists have been killed in the world when they were doing their job? According to UNESCO, as you can see in this slide, well, in fact, UNESCO does this depressing accounting. Well, 1,010 journalists were killed all over the world in 2018. And UNESCO always says, and our guest of honor, Guy Berger, who manages the division concerned with these facts, 93% of these people are not war correspondents. They're just local reporters. Those who talk about corruption, or write rather about corruption, organized crime, local mafias. Only 7% are foreign or war correspondents. And we honor them. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, 90% of these crimes went unpunished. It's huge. It means that impunity is almost total. You know that in Italy, journalists have been killed. Ossigeno honors their memory. According to our calculations, most of them were carrying out their duty ethically and professionally, and they were killed by people who were afraid of what they might tell their leaders. And we have 28 of those. 11 were killed in Italy, and 17 were killed abroad. Last year, the figure was 98.3%. Journalists killed, the situation is therefore much more favorable in Italy than at the international level, but impunity is still there. This year we did what we did the year before. We calculated impunity for all these incidents in Italy. Threats, mainly threats. So we're not talking about people being killed, we're talking about journalists being threatened. UNESCO tells us that killed journalists are the tip of the iceberg, the use of violence to influence the news. For one journalist who is killed, many others are harassed. They are submitted to the so-called non-fatal attacks, threatening letters, attacks, assaults. Here you can see how many journalists have been threatened. We don't have statistics because Ossigeno only started 10 years ago. We started to list these cases and to follow them closely. so as to be able to act in a timely fashion when we need to help our colleagues who are being attacked. On the basis of this monitoring, we found out that as of 2006, 3,722 journalists were threatened. However, as of 2011, the figure went down to 3,122. As of 2011, we started classifying these incidents with, let's say, more accurately on the basis of elements that allow us to analyze the information and develop statistics, and also statistics on impunity. On the basis of this information, impunity equals 98.3%. This from 2011. However, in the last 12 months, something happened. Something happened in statistics and in our monitoring field. We noticed a substantial decrease. Impunity is still very, very high. It still hovers around 90%. 90% means that only 1 out of 10 is punished. So the problem is still huge. But there was a change. Out of 316 attacks that we followed, recorded, and analyzed in the last 12 months, 31 were followed up and found some sort of justice. Therefore, the perpetrators were identified, reported to justice, prosecuted, and sometimes convicted. Since we try to be as scientific as we can, we should analyze these trends, because if this trend goes on increasing, maybe this means that we are on the right path. In Italy, of course, we have these terrible problems, but under many respects, we are better off than other countries. For instance, in the field of journalist protection, of course, more should be done. But the system works far better than it does in other countries, in Malta, in Slovakia, in other countries where maybe no journalists were killed in the last few months, but they have been threatened and harassed, and they are afraid of going to the police or of reporting their attacks to the police. There are 19 journalists living under escort. We hope the information has changed, but still something is being done for threatened journalists. We criticize our Italian authorities because we want them to do better. However, we should admit that our system works and journalists are protected, and the government is acting before they get killed. Therefore, what has changed? Well, we found out that something was changing right after the attack to Pier Vincenzi, a journalist called Mr. Pier Vincenzi, in Ostia. Why? Because there was a video. The video was circulated a great deal. It became viral, and got the attention not only of the media but also of unions, politicians, etc. Then, not long later, Paolo Borrometi in Sicily was threatened of being killed. Therefore, in the face of these incidents, the population started demonstrating, making its voice heard, and our judicial acted with determination, an unprecedented determination. After a few days, the perpetrators were arrested, and then Andrea Di Pietro will explain that these crimes, which were serious per se, were aggravated by the use of what we in Italy call the mafia method. You attack these journalists not because you were attacking that person, but to create a general atmosphere of intimidation. The aggressors of Mr. Piervincenzi were sentenced to 6 years of jails. In the last 12 months, the aggravating circumstance of using a mafia method has been used twice, and we hope that this trend is here to stay. There are other cases, such as, for instance, the aggression of Maria Grazia Mazzola in Bari, where there's a lot of uncertainty. Nothing concrete appears to have been done, and 8 months have elapsed, even though, in our opinion, there are many elements whereby that incident is quite similar to the other ones for which the mafia method was invoked. Another signal of this change, greater determination in considering attacks to journalists very serious, came from another judge in the Marche region. This refers to an attack to Nello Trocchia, a journalist and his cameraman who, they're freelance media workers, and they were working for RAI. They were attacked, hurt. Their equipment was destroyed by a relative of a person who had been arrested and accused and that they had been researching. In this case, the judge charged the perpetrator with a new crime, interruption of public service. The judge wrote that preventing a journalist and a cameraman to work and report so that our public television may inform our citizens about important facts, well, this is the interruption of a public service. And this is something we had been asking for a long time. We believe that it's not just the fact that it's not that only people working for a public television carry out a public service. Anybody who informs citizens and respects his or her own professional ethics are carrying out a public service, and their work should be protected and defended. We hope that this trend continues, and actually becomes stronger. We submitted several proposals, and I will mention some of them. Proposals concerning amendments to our legislation, amendments that are necessary to protect journalists and defend the liberty of the press. Recent events tell us that there are laws, procedures, and rules which do exist and could be enforced in a different way. Therefore, it's a general attitude of omission. If you think of the case law of the European Court for Human Rights, well, that's very seldom used in Italy. And this, I don't think this is deliberate. I think that this case law is not really necessarily known by the judges. And I think that professional training or professional development courses for judges should provide for additional courses in the right to be informed. Therefore, we do hope that existing rules be enforced more efficiently. There are many things that we have been proposing for a long time, and we do hope that somebody will start doing something. We ask for the introduction of a specific crime for those who deliberately act to prevent the right to inform the public as provided for by Article 21 of the Constitution and Article 10 of the European Convention for Human Rights. We ask for aggravating circumstances to be applied to crimes committed to that purpose. And regarding press information, of course, we are not going to write bills. We are just an observing post. We don't write laws. But we insist so that libel by the press be considered as a civil offense and not as a criminal crime on the basis of a bill that was submitted last year. We need an efficient deterrent in order to prevent the willful use of suits to harass and intimidate journalists. We also ask that jail not be considered as one of the punishments. There's a proposal submitted by the Anti-Mafia Parliamentary Committee in 2015 that we share, and this envisages the splitting of the crime of libel or defamation and to apply it to willful or malicious behaviors. That is, people who deliberately use the information machine wrongly. And this has nothing to do with libel or defamation. It's just something else. It is what we call the mud machine. And this is not the same thing as libel. It is as if a surgeon deliberately cuts a limb to an enemy of his, using the so-called mud machine means using the information machine in reverse. And it's not libel. I think we all agree on this. Whereas libel or slander or defamation, which is often just not voluntary. It's a misuse of information and should be considered as a civil offense, like, I don't know, doctors or lawyers. If they make a mistake, they will have to pay. Now, if a journalist makes a mistake, I don't know, wrong name, failure to check information, they risk being arrested. Current law says that this behavior should be considered as voluntary. Moreover, political debate led to some findings that we should not neglect. You may remember the lessons we learned when the daily Unità experienced a very serious crisis. When a publisher has problems, as happened to the Unità daily, and this person asks for a bankruptcy procedure, this person gets rid of any liability, even the liability linked to libel. And what happened there? That scores of journalists who had been sued for libel at political time when the Unità was the main political opposition daily, well, these journalists were no longer protected by their publisher, because the publisher asks for the bankruptcy procedure, and criminal liability falls on the newspaper people. And this is extremely serious, because some of these journalists, many of these journalists were acquitted, some of them were found guilty, some are still being tried, and some were helping with our law office. They might also end up having to pay damages that normally should have been paid by the publisher. At the time, everybody believed in the need of having an additional law in order to try and offset this injustice. Of course, right, but I think that the civil code should explicitly state that the publisher of a daily is always and remains responsible for the criminal and civil consequences of whatever he publishes. And it is the publisher, not the journalist who wrote the article, who is responsible. Because this is as if an industrialist manufacturing a vacuum cleaner, and the vacuum cleaner damages its user. The user will, of course, ask for damages to the company, not to the engineer who designed it. So there's a lot of work to do here. But we need to do it, or else we, as journalists, should be aware that we are working in a very, very difficult situation, because if our publisher sells or goes bankrupt, we will be the only victims. We can be sued civilly or criminally also for things that we're not responsible for. I'm almost finished. Just one more thing. We believe that we in Italy need systems of out-of-court settlement for disputes between newspapers and readers. In many countries, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, this exists. There are self-regulation systems, media category systems, no, sorry, accountability systems, media accountability systems. There are people from the press, publishers, journalists, representatives of consumers and of readers. They are self-financed and they settle disputes on the basis of a shared code. Well, first of all, it's quick and cheap. And the worst possible sanction is the publication on all member papers, let's say a blame vis-à-vis a newspaper refusing to publicly correct one of its articles. In these countries, this works very well because they affect a person or newspaper's credibility. Therefore, a paper asked to make a correction usually corrects because is afraid of losing his credibility because of the decisions of the media accountability system. And I think in Italy, too, we should try and do something like that because we're confronted by a crisis in the credibility of papers. We see this also when we work with the Press Federation, and we try to promote solidarity vis-à-vis journalists who are the victims of unwarranted attacks. But often we are told, well, you know, I have a different opinion. This journalist writes for a paper who has a different political position than me, and so I refuse to proclaim my solidarity. The situation here in Italy is very polarized. It's very extreme. So what people don't get is that we need to defend not just people who are being attacked, violently criticized or threatened or hit. Whatever he wrote is irrelevant when there's violence. This is the first thing. We should therefore hope that the next law will provide that once a correction is made, no criminal or civil procedure can be started. But as we said, we have 5,000 criminal complaints and 1,000 civil suits. But I don't think that going to the courts is the right way to protest, because we're not always talking about defamation. Therefore, having media accountability systems which do not require specific laws or public financing is something that the parties involved should do. We are willing to help. We're working to act as facilitators for this kind of operation. We believe that this might get rid of about 80% of the groundless criminal complaints, which, in our opinion, are just the wrong way of facing this problem. One last thing. This would also help newspapers to be more credible. And then monitoring.
We have registered all these attempts against freedom of expression and press freedom for 10 years now. Now, we're not going to do this forever. We just wanted to show that this is something that can be done. We can collect unbiased information and data. And this, in and of itself, is already a system that protects reporters from the most serious attacks. And of course, if you want to protect reporters, then you have to be aware about what's going on so that you can respond to these events. We've based all of this on our own resources. We are an independent organization. Our resources are limited. I think that we have attained our objective. I hope that an independent public organization will take over soon. Just by way of example, AGICOM or any other organization in the public sector. Of course, we're willing to give our contribution in terms of expertise and our scholars and experts, because I think that there should be a follow-up of what we've done so far. We need to make all of this more official, institutional, and as requested by the Council of Europe, as from 2016, with a very specific recommendation aimed at all states, has asked to set up such organizations to this end. So I hope this will have a follow-up, and I think we should also do something else. Over the last 12 months, we have realized that there are some difficulties in reporting to law enforcement or to official authorities the most serious events. There's no one single interlocutor to whom to turn to when these things happen. So I think that we should set up this public platform, a public platform that would have to pull together official organizations such as ours, Association of the Press, the Order of Journalists, and that could do some awareness raising about what's going on. We have referred to the platform of the Council of Europe for this. This platform has a legal framework. It has been going on for a few years now. And so we should refer to this platform of the Council of Europe to make our own in Italy. And I hope that we can soon set this up. I have set the scene for the debate, and we are open to any request for the floor and ready to listen to the other speeches. Thank you.
Mi veniva in mente a proposito.
When coming to decriminalization, between 2014 and 2018, 3 countries have decriminalized defamation press, UK, Wales, and Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso, there was this reporter who was in prison because under defamation charges, and the European Court of Human Rights said that reporters couldn't be in prison for defamation charges, and that's how it came. I mean, for the decriminalization of this offense. Welcome to the MPs who have just arrived. And now let me give the floor to Marcello Cardani, who chairs Agicom. There's a third survey now on the status of reporters, and this is a survey carried out by Agicom, and this is the third edition of this survey. And the thousands colleagues attending and giving their contribution to the survey. And I think that this is one of the most useful tools that we may use to really have a general feeling about the status of the human condition, professional condition of Italian reporters. Most of the people here today are reporters, so you know what I'm talking about. Thank you, Professor Cardani, for being here today. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for introducing me. Now, this survey will be successful if the feedback is significant. So thank you for talking about this survey that we are presently carrying out. I'm here today with a double hat as chair of Agicom, but also as a citizen. And as a citizen, I have to report to the chair of Agicom that we have a major problem, and that is the following: to preach to the converts. But what I mean by this is that every time we speak to an audience to talk about an issue which supposedly is a subject on which we are all informed about, may seem to be a useless activity, because if you're a convert, then you you don't need this additional support. But as a matter of fact, there are some gaps to be filled up, because yes, some of us are convicts, and by this I mean we are aware of what's going on for some events, and this against reporters is, of course, a negative thing. Attacks against anyone is negative, and we firmly believe this. Reporters somehow bring an added value because of the public role they are playing and the service they're providing to society at large. So if we all share this idea, then I think that we should go through some concepts, some ideas, some data, just to go through this process. And once again, I know we are all converts, but still we need to go through the process again. What we're talking about today is something very serious. And this is because we're going through a major crisis in the sector of journalism. The sector of information at large is going through a transition period. The old model, i.e. the press, paper press, is going through a major crisis, whereas the new press, digital press, is gaining ground. And therefore, because we're going through a period of transition, we are going through a period of fragility, because we are talking about a brand new, or anyway, recent new digital media. And of course, it has to gain strength. And of course, this means that the parliament and the government have to approach this phenomenon in a different way, because given this specific fragility of the old model and of the new model, it is very important to have a contribution by the public sector. So this new model is gaining ground for a number of very evident reasons. First of all, it's cheap. Buying a newspaper was more costly than opening up a blog today, so anyone can afford it. We are all more or less literate about this, and by this I mean providing information. This is the asset we are talking about, which of course is an important asset. It goes viral because if you hit the right chord, it can really be extremely successful, and it is extremely swift. It just takes a few seconds to disseminate information. Now, information is not always negative. There are there's also positive sides when we talk about the digital media, but now our concern is the negative side. And therefore, of course, I'm referring to fake news. Traditional media, newspapers, are going through some very hard times. This is because even though there's a very slight change over the last 12 months, there's been a slight change over the last 12 months, people are reading much less than before. They read much less books, but also newspapers. Newspapers, in and of themselves, have reduced their influence, but this is important not only because of the information content, because we're not only saying where, why, and where and when, but they especially should say how. Basically, the press gives an all-round information. They give comprehensive information, and therefore, yes, they do give information, but they also give food for thought. And this is what information is all about. In other words, giving citizens, giving society sources of information to allow them to set up a debate in an informed manner. This, of course, has a negative effect on many sectors. Also the sector of politics. As a young guy, when I was 18 or 16, I was in politics, and I remember the so-called political rallies we would take to the streets, and of course, without. I'm not talking about those politicians who would talk for 10 hours like in Cuba, but I mean, these political rallies would last for a couple of hours. And so there was this, basically, the way you would present information was full of real information, whereas today we are based on Twitters, and they're very so the possibility of delving into this information is now very reduced, and therefore politics today is basically an activity whereby you only surface the information. You talk about things in a very limited way, very down to earth, and therefore this is. This means that if you want to operate in the field of information, there are some difficulties. This means information basically means, I mean, it not only means when, where and when. It's not just a train schedule, but it basically means providing information and being a source of ideas. So, on top of this difficulty, there's also another source of concern, and that is violence, be it verbal or physical violence, or even in more serious cases where reporters have been killed, or less serious cases when reporters anyway are being attacked, which of course goes against the world of ideas or the environment of ideas. I mean, but unfortunately, this is something that is part of today's life. Hence, the fragility of journalism because of increased risks in a sector which is growing weaker and weaker. This can also clearly be seen by the findings of our observatories, as Posimato was saying. We want to provide information not because we're entomologists, but because information is the essential essence of communication, and this is our mandate. So we have these observatories on journalism, and we're talking about the last service, which dates back to 1968, and there's going to be a conference today on dating back to the 1968 this afternoon. Anyway, so there was a slip of the tongue. So this is a survey of May 2018. This survey says the following, that apart from the very serious events that we referred to this morning, there's also, I mean, these events are a source of concern in the long term for journalism. And first of all, I would like to refer to the aging of the workforce. This group of reporters is aging. The average age is increasingly older. This basically means that the number of young reporters is decreasing. Likewise, independent journalists are overwhelmingly more numerous than dependent journalists. They account 1/4 of the total number of reporters, and this is another source of concern. Over the last 15 years, there is an upward trend of low-income households, meaning less than 35,000 euros per annum. 40% of reporters in Italy earn less than 5,000 euros per annum. This is ridiculous. Therefore, this means that people are exposed to very high risks. I mean, because they cannot meet ends because of the very low income that they have. And there's a high percentage of reporters who are doing their job as a part-time. Their work is precarious and their future is extremely uncertain. And of course, unfortunately, gender issues are on the increase. And by this I mean the male reporters outnumber women reporters. And this is another instance of gender discrimination. So if we add up all of this to other two things, i.e. the aggression against reporters, be them physical attacks or verbal attacks, and together with a general crisis of the sector, of course, I mean, reporters are part of this global scenario, which is hitting hard the sector of journalism and of information. And all of this is a source of concern, of serious concern, because when it comes to a crisis of a professional category, in this case of the journalism, this is a source of concern, and therefore an intervention by the public sector is of the essence. It has to give a contribution, and we're now talking about a very important category because journalism has an important democratic role, a social role. If we really want to have a proper democracy in a country. So they do play a very important role. AGICOM is doing its utmost in terms of using intellectual resources to delve into this scenario. And of course, it's not easy to find easy recipes to solve issues which are not only technological issues, and of course technological issues do also have positive trends. And of course, therefore, the society would not go against it. But we cannot allow such an important sector for the democracy be curtailed in its activity. Thank you.
Grazie Presidente, perché lei ha...
Thank you. Thank you for giving us a background. You mentioned very important words: transition, fragility, gender, and then you mentioned Parliament and the government. We have two undersecretaries here, so maybe we can start with Senator Vito Crimi, who's Undersecretary Publishing and therefore he is really central to our debate. You have the floor, sir. Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the information you shared with us. I met Mr. Spampinato several times since I started being Undersecretary. This International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, the United Nations General Assembly raised to the attention of the public the issue of the safety of journalists. This, of course, concerns us all, especially in view of what is happening in Italy and in other countries. A significant initiative, both regarding its goals and its values. It is necessary to safeguard journalists, the freedom of the press and of the media in order to protect a healthy development for any society and any democracy. Societies and democracies are rooted in knowledge, and knowledge needs to be the fruit of the work of journalists, free to carry out their activity independently and without interferences. Unfortunately, also in this century, journalists keep being killed. By killing and threatening journalists, the purpose is that of limiting the freedom of the press. We're thinking of Jamal Khashoggi now and Daphne Caruana Galizia, two of the most recent and dramatic cases. Italy is concerned about the situation. These two cases are quite different from each other, but they both greatly violate human rights. Attacks against the freedom of the press, attempts to eliminate knowledge, and the government cannot but condemn any violation of human rights and also acts like this. Journalists have to carry out a strategic duty. If you look at Italy, we should remember that in Italy, 11 journalists had been killed, as President Spampinato said, and many have been threatened, harassed, and live under escort. Think of Federica Angeli, a courageous journalist in Ostia. There is an actual conflict between the government and the mafia. Federica Angelo was the victim of the Spada gang. Filippo Mele, a journalist of the Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno, who recently received an envelope with a bullet. And he answered by saying, "I'm not afraid. You will not prevent me to keep writing and speaking." Mafia kills and silence kills too. Out of the 35 cases of threats and harassment between the end of 2017 and early 2018, most cases saw threats on the web, or there were violent behaviors, anonymous calls. In many cases, it was organized crime, but sometimes there were political reasons as well. We also analyzed the data of recent years. In 2016 and 17, intimidation against journalists were 128. Between January and February this year, we had 18 cases. They all deserve great attention by the government, which is determined to fight against violence and threats against media workers. Freedom of the press is essential for our society. We should also think about how to protect journalists when they do their job. It is necessary to act in order to protect this profession, and that's why we're going to support a number of legislative initiatives. First of all, precarious, meaning time. Journalists who don't have a regular contract are weak. They don't earn enough, and they're easy to blackmail. They are weaker. fighting in order to try and fight this position is also a struggle for the freedom of information and of the press. Then protecting sources. Can we really talk about freedom of the press and democracy of knowledge if we can fear the circulation of the names of the sources of a journalist? Professional secrecy is essential. Incidentally, Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights protects this right by saying that this is the consequent and logical corollary of the right to freely search information. And then protecting journalists from being sued and intimidated. Many journalists are asked for large amounts of money in terms of damages for slander. In many cases, these are other forms of harassment. This is unacceptable and should be fought against. There is a bill which envisages damages to the news workers who are brought to court with groundless claims. During the debate, we may include many of the proposals that we heard here today, because resorting to legal action is the only solution in some cases when there is a legitimate claim. And this should be also safeguarded. And then there was another interesting point. What tools can we use to protect the freedom of the press? Criminal repression is adequate to fight the attempts to limit this freedom. There are huge political, economic, and financial conflicts of interest in the case of some publishers, which undermine the growth of independent information. To defend freedom of the press, the government is ready to play its role. It is determined to defend the freedom and pluralism and independence of the media. And this is Article 21 of the Constitution and Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. I'd also like to stress here that freedom of the press requires a cultural revolution. That's why in the beginning I use the word function and not just job, because journalists carry out a social function, the function of informing, of creating a background whereby readers may form an opinion based on facts and on their description. That's why our protection of pluralism and freedom of the press aims at supporting projects to teach young people to directly interpret all the information they get, the stimuli they receive, not only through newspapers but through the web, to be able to make a distinction between what is news and what is fake news, between who actually tries to report the truth and those who don't, those who use their function only to transmit their own opinions, sometimes distorting facts. We would also like to support any innovative initiative to support the revolution that is taking place in the world of information for the purpose of broadening pluralism and access to information that should remain free, not only under this aspect, but also under the aspect of accessing it. Thomas Jefferson used to say that the freedom of all depends on the freedom of the press, and this cannot be limited without being lost. And this is the reason why we feel responsible for defending pluralistic, free and independent press in this country. It's mainly independent from politics.
Mi scuso, ma devo allontanarmi.
I apologize, but as I said earlier, I have to go, unfortunately.
Grazie Senatore, noi abbiamo preso nota di tutto. Grazie per essere intervenuto, lo sappiamo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Vorrei adesso chiedere al Senatore Pietro Grasso se...
May I now ask Senator Pietro Grasso to take the floor? Grasso is an honorary member of our association. He is very well known. He is on the front line, and thank you for being here today. I would like to thank you for the invitation and for giving me this opportunity to take the floor. I really wanted to participate in this very important initiative of Ossigeno. Ossigeno has been carrying out a very important activity through the years, and we would like to thank you for what you've done. And we are longtime friends, and when I was a magistrate and as a politician, I have really appreciated the important role of journalism when journalism is free and in a society, in a democratic society. And we have often fought together for our country. And I have often expressed gratitude for your commitment. And there are so many reporters who are limited in carrying out their role. Today, there's increased awareness about the difficulties of reporters, and this is all because thank you to what Ossigeno has been doing. Citizens are more aware, are more informed, and it is thanks to Ossigeno if attacked reporters no longer feel alone today. There is a network of solidarity which protects reporters. The data shown by our observatory confirm that we cannot always protect them as much as we would like to, with dire consequences. So today's initiative gives an idea of the scope of this problem. Around the globe, there are so many reporters which are under attack or killed. The most recent cases have been mentioned this morning. We must not underestimate the impact of limits to the freedom of expression on society. A democracy be called a democracy unless citizens are allowed to be a part of the choices of society. This means that each citizen must be given the opportunity to have access to a free and pluralistic information. And this will give him the opportunity to develop his own ideas and to be more informed in general. Now, therefore, we ask media workers to be very rigorous. We ask them to tell the truth, uncompromising truth, especially when you conceal truth and you can damage society for this. And we want them to be unbiased in giving this information. But of course, this means taking risks, and many reporters have gone through these major risks. Our country, too, has had such tragic events. Just think about Ilaria Alpi, Impastato, Mauro Rostagno, Mario Francese, Giuseppe Favi, and all other women and men reporters who have paid with their life their desire to seek the truth. But we must not only look at the past. Rather, we have to focus our attention on the numerous reporters who are day by day facing just as equal risks and threats. And the data today show this very clearly. In Italy, we have this very serious problem, a problem which is often a local problem where it is harder to be on the spotlight when it comes to local reality. Very often, the perpetrators of these attacks to reporters go unpunished. And so, the reaction to all this is that finally you would rather go enter into a compromise, you skip the hard truths, turn your back to things which happen, leaving things unchanged. I'm proud of those. I'm proud of all those people who have also been courageous against attacks. Just think about Borrobini, Daniele Pervigenzi, Federica Angeli. In recent days, she has been under attack, and also her family has been under attack. And they're really examples of great professionalism and also of passion in performing a role which is to the benefit of all of us. Between September and October, the boss who has threatened Borrometi has been convicted with the aggravating circumstance of mafia-related method. This leads us to be more optimistic about the future. No space has been given to those who threaten freedom of the press. Let me add to this a couple of still pending issues. And we have often been talking about these problems. In previous government, I've been trying to face this issue. So we know that we have to address this issue. And being part of the opposition here today, I will support any initiative along these lines. And I really hope that the ruling majority will take steps to move forward. And this has already been said by Senator Crimi. One very last comment. The press is under attack, as we said, and we've been going through very hard times. There's been insults, threats, which have been against the press, and this is a source of concern. There is a tendency to delegitimize the profession of journalism, and finally, there some people just say, well, yeah, you're just done. You are useless. Some people say, we're going to stop funding your newspaper. So it really is a source of major concern. Journalists are being attacked, being simply the servants of specific lobbies. And this applies across the board for all those who were actually fighting for ideals and values. So we have to appreciate and all those who think about things in a different way, because otherwise the risk would be for all of us to be all part and parcel of one single ideal or value. We will all end up only be talking about those who are on the same page. So, of course, we want uneasy truths, quote unquote. We need people who really want to talk about their investigations, who are holding on to their values and ideas, reporters who have to give up their professionalism, basically represent a failure of our country and of Europe. So a Europe less free Europe would finally risk having detrimental effects throughout society across the board in all European countries. Unfortunately, I have to leave, even though I would have loved to participate to this very interesting meeting. Thank you.
Grazie, Presidente Grasso.
Thank you. Thank you also for mentioning the risk of this echo chamber where we can only end up talking to ourselves, the prejudice of consensus. It's now time for Mr. Andrea Di Pietro. He coordinates Ossigeno's legal service. Ossigeno, among other things, finances the legal protection of journalists. It's an English, a British charity that does it. And thanks to that financing, we can defend 7 Italian colleagues every year, 7 every year. The names are not necessarily made public. This year, with the Roman Union of Journalists, we opened a legal assistance window at La Torretta, where colleagues who have been harassed, sued, can report for free and with no need to be necessarily a subscriber to the union. Mr. Di Pietro coordinates this orchestra with the little financial resources we have. I'd like to thank the Senate again, who every year makes all its structures available and give us this wonderful venue, the ancient library of the Senate. Paola Spadari, who presides the legal register of Lazio, is here, and I'd like to thank her. Thank you very much. Therefore, now the floor to Andrea Di Pietro. who will discuss the legal and case law aspects linked to the condition of Italian journalism. Good morning. Thank you, Professor Minella. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to make a contribution to this meeting with a point of view which is different from the one that most of you have, that of an attorney who every day works to defend the freedom of information. A real front, the front of courts, tribunals, where we go every day and are confronted with what we mentioned earlier, vexatious litigation, journalists who are defendants because they're accused of a crime, or trials where the journalist is a victim. This indicates how hugely paradoxical the situation of this profession is in Italy. If we think of it in concrete terms, we notice that on one hand, from the criminal point of view, journalists are there to answer for a crime which is willful and for which detention can also reach 6 years. And the possibility of being submitted to searches, preventative seizures, being put on bail. From the point of view of civil law, as Mrs. Pampinato was said, it's even more paradoxical because the economic aspects of the journalist's life are involved. The journalists will never be able to ask to be relieved from the economic problems issuing from his job. Think of the Unità, the case that Mrs. Pampinato mentioned earlier. This clause is not envisaged by the civil code, and it only works if there is a specific provision in their agreement. And therefore, it only works for very important newspapers which give this kind of security to the journalist. And this indicates, again, how paradoxical the situation is and what problems journalists may be called to face in a court. However, as Mrs. Pampinato was saying earlier, as of last year, many important things happened, and, well, they have already been mentioned by Senator Pietro Grasso. In my opinion, this year was quite outstanding from the point of view of punishing journalists, punishing those who attack journalists. Aggravating circumstances have applied. Crimes were identified which had never happened before. These new charges, well, even I didn't really believe that these charges would apply or be admitted. In some cases, they seem to me to be a bit too much. I mean, the intention was certainly a good intention by the judge, who tried to somehow create a new type of legislation by somehow straining existing laws. Well, these charges were strong enough to go through a whole trial and to end up with official judgments. There are well-known cases, Daniele Per Vincenzo and Piero Bormiti, but there are cases that are less well-known. One in particular, which is very important from the legal point of view, and it affects the then RAI reporter Nello Trocchia. And we will discuss this in the end because that case is quite peculiar, different from the others. You know that Pier Vincenzo and Boromiti saw their right to carry out their job hindered by serious acts of violence and threat. Pier Vincenzo was physically attacked. He was butt-headed, and the public opinion was severely shaken by this, also because there was a video that was shown many, many times. Brutal violence. And we saw that this person was just reacting to the fact that the reporter was annoying him with uncomfortable questions. A characteristic of this was the fact that this person was not only acting because, of his own reaction, his own violence, his own nature somehow, his own psychology. Rather, he acted because he felt strengthened by the fact that he belonged to a mafia gang, and this made him feel so strong. This is Roberto Spada. On the 18th of June 2018, the Tribunal of Rome sentenced him to 6 years of detention for assault and battery, intimidation. And these were, we can add the aggravating circumstance of adopting a mafia method, a type of aggravating circumstance that was approved in 1991. This was very important because the court was not made up of one judge, but there was it was a collegiate court, and this makes it more important and is one of the reasons why the sentence was 6 years. The other person was subjected to threats by another person, and we all could hear what this perpetrator said. And the criminal court of Syracuse sentenced De Carolis, the perpetrator, to 2 years and 8 months. Not 6 years, but still higher than the limit under which he could have been put on bail. In this case, too, he was accused of assault and battery, aggravated by adoption of a mafia method. In other terms, drawing strength from the fact that his brother was part of the mafia gang called Botaro. Last year, when I talked at the End Impunity meeting, I said that threats to journalists normally end up in front of the Justice of the Peace, and normally end with fines, because justices of the peace cannot sentence people to jail according to the law. And these fines normally end up by never being actually paid. Therefore, our criminal regulations are not equipped to deal with this sort of events, because it treats journalists as if they were normal people. Journalists are not entitled to a higher level of protection, because it's not just their physical person that needs to be protected, but also the function that they carry out. For many years, Ossigeno has requested that specific crimes against journalists be dealt with in a way that would safeguard freedom of information and freedom of the press as a collective good, not as a privilege of individual journalists. And I'm saying this because in the cases of Piervincenzo and Gorromito, we owe it to the straining of the law and to resort to the aggravating circumstances of the mafia. If we hadn't had that, the penalty would have been absolutely ridiculous, and these trials would not have meant anything. And that's why the prosecutors decided to use these aggravating circumstances, which are maybe a little bit too much. I mean, as I said earlier, there's been a little bit of straining, but the purpose was achieved. The incident with Nello Trocchio is also interesting. He was working for a TV show called Nemo, Italian Rai, and he was interviewing people for the murder of Omar Prota. And the brother of the victim prevented him from asking his questions. He attacked him and his cameraman with kicks, punches, insults, and he also destroyed the camera. And that's why this is an extraordinary year. For the first time, the perpetrator was charged not only with assault and battery and personal injury, because these two reporters were actually harmed, also interruption of public service. And I'm going to read the charges because it's really interesting. Trotta has been charged with a crime punished under Article 340 of the Criminal Code, because by assaulting and hurting the news operators, he interrupted the regularity of the public service of TV information for the show called Nemo, which was why Trocchia and Cremona were doing their job. And on the basis of these facts, the perpetrator was submitted to a precautionary measure. A public service was interrupted, and this had never happened before. These three cases indicate a new tendency. They're like pilot cases, a new tendency of the Italian judiciary, which never, as this year, has decided to defend freedom of the press and to combat impunity with all the tools that our system puts at their disposal. It's probably also, we probably owe this to Ossigeno. Ossigeno has been working for over 10 years in trying to raise awareness about these topics, which were not even mentioned until 10 years ago, or at least the people were sort of embarrassed, ill at ease when talking about this. Now, thanks to Ossigeno, this is possible. I believe that the categories who represent journalists, unions, and professional registers should join under this profile, because information will never be free of harassment and impunity unless journalists are given a special legal status to protect them. We're not talking about individual privileges for individual journalists. We're talking about a tool which would guarantee a better quality of information, a better knowledge of what is going on, and a better life for those who work in this area under the risk of being sued or charged or physically aggressed.
Thank you. And this is interesting, changing, just trying to change the legal framework. We're just starting to work on it. But of course, we need to keep this under careful watch. Now we have two international contributions. First, Alain Désir. He comes from Martinique. Alain Désir is a minister, you're member of the European Parliament. Would like to say goodbye to Mr. Cardani. Mario Marcellini would represent Agicom here with us. So, Alain Désir. Alain Désir has been a minister of the French government, a member of the European Parliament, and as from 2017, he is representing the so we will now listen to his presentation. Thank you.
Friends of Ossigeno, on the occasion of this event that you have organized in the Italian Senate, I would like to praise your monitoring of the situation of media freedom and your effort toward ending impunity in Italy. Every day in the world and in the OSCE region, journalists are threatened, harassed, attacked because of their work. Most of them are not attacked because they cover armed conflict or wars, but just because they report, they investigate on political issues, on corruption cases, on human rights, or on organized crime. They inform us, the citizen. They hold those in power accountable. They give a voice to critical views. They refuse censorship. And they are a cornerstone of democracy. But they are now at risk, not only in dictatorships, but everywhere, including in democratic countries. They are the target of smear campaigns and of many threats and intimidation. And those who attack them most of the time go unpunished. On the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, we say that there can be no tolerance for those who attack journalists. We say that an attack against a journalist is an assault on our own right to be informed and to live in free society. It is a shame that in 85% of more than 400 cases of killed journalists in the last 25 years in the OSCE region, those responsible for these crimes have not been arrested or prosecuted. Impunity is the second crime against the killed journalists and an terrible encouragement for more aggression in the future. We remember the names of those who were killed last year in our region, the OSCE region. Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, Jan Kuciak and his fiancée in Slovakia, the journalist of Capital Gazette in Annapolis in the USA, Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, the mysterious death of Maxim Borodin in Russia. Protecting safety of journalists is a matter of urgency. The political attacks against the press are dangerous and must stop. All threats must be investigated and the perpetrators brought to justice. The fight against impunity of crimes against journalists must become a priority for all. I call on all states, all actors, civil society, law enforcement and police to join forces. Together, we can defend free and independent journalists. Together, we must protect the free press as a pillar of our own freedom and of democracy. I wish you a very successful gathering. Thank you very much.
Ecco, grazie a Desir.
Now today, Juna Mijatovic was supposed to be here with us from 2018. She's been a member of the Commission for Human Rights of the European Council, of the Council of Europe, and but unfortunately she had to leave for Turkey. Something else must have happened down there. But anyway, she wanted to convey this message to us, and Ilaria Femora will be reading this message to us. Thank you. Safety of reporters in Europe is going through a very hard times. The reporters who are attacked are just the tip of the iceberg of all threats. Attacks to reporters, detention and judicial attacks, political private harassment threats are affecting reporters around the globe. This is a situation which is aggravated by crimes against reporters, which is on the increase. Investigations on killings against reporters are dragging on for years. The perpetrators are sometimes brought to justice. Very often, they are not the real perpetrators, are never really identified. So impunity is an even greater threat, and this, of course, deepens the sorrow of the families of the reporters. It is a threat for the credibility of public institutions, and it violates the obligations of states based on international laws on human rights to protect reporters. In other words, impunity puts at risk democracy and the rule of law. And now, therefore, it is essential for state actors to do their utmost to make this phenomenon even worse. We must guarantee protection to reporters, so we must guarantee timely, independent, and efficient investigations in all cases of threats against reporters. But this fight against impunity in and of itself will not be enough to guarantee protection and freedom to reporters. State actors must also come to concrete measures to protect reporters and their families. For this to be done, states must show greater commitment in implementing the laws they have set up, and they have to better use the already existing instruments. Namely, I think it is extremely important to follow 4 specific measures. And I quote, first of all, to implement the recommendation of the Council of Europe on safety of reporters and other media workers. Specific measures to be applied for prevention, protection, and prosecution, and awareness raising of public opinion and training. Point 2, to standardize national legislation to international legislation when it comes to freedom of expression. Laws have to be adopted to preserve the safety of reporters. against any attack. We have decriminalized defamation and guaranteed that laws on terrorism, disinformation, and security-related issues must not limit the freedom and the safety of reporters. Number 3, modify the public debate vis-à-vis the media, the press. Political leaders and all people who are involved, who have a sway on public opinion, have the duty to avoid any hostile debate against reporters. They have to condemn all physical and verbal attacks against reporters. They have to protect the freedom of expression and the press, freedom of press, and not go against it. They have to support all initiatives geared at supporting the activity of reporters. Italy can play a leading role, even if many reporters have been killed in the past. Today, still, they are under attack, including a political opposition against reporters, but yet you still have a highly diversified press. The political environment and the judiciary have been protecting you for many years. The Association of Journalists and NGOs are constantly watching over freedom of expression. So within this context, I would like to thank Ossigeno per l'Informazione for having organized today's event, and let me congratulate Ossigeno for the awareness-raising activity, for the activity carried out by reporters. You have also made increased awareness on some specific events against reporters. This is a perfect instance of what we can do to contribute to the work already carried out by the Council of Europe and what the Council of Europe have often recommended to the member states. Without a free press, there's no such thing as democracy. We are going through some hard times, but we can catch up. I think we do have the appropriate instruments to reverse the trend. We just have to use them.
Grazie. La Dunia Mijatovic, avete sentito? Questi
So, what we just heard now is two very important messages, and they're giving out some very important information. The message that was now read in Mijatovic is very important. For instance, we have to be very careful when we use the legal framework in the respective countries. We have to balance out international legislation with domestic legislation and the role to be played by the state for the protection of reporters. And these are exactly the issues that we are addressing in our organization. I would like to ask Guy Berger to take the floor. He is our guest of honor.
Ma semplicemente perché è in effetti
He is the director of UNESCO, Freedom of Expression. Guy Berger is an activist in the field of human rights, and he's been so for 40 years from South Africa. In South Africa, he was very active in the fight against apartheid, so he went through his prison years, and he went through a major ordeal. He has been a reporter. He was the director of the Rhodesia School of Journalism, and as from 2011, am I right? Yes. And as from 2011, he is the director of the UNESCO Division for Freedom of Expression. Ossigeno would like to thank Guy Berger wholeheartedly. It is a great honor for us to have him here today because we know that he has a very busy agenda, and so thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Guy.
Buongiorno. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I greet all the distinguished fellow panelists, Mr. Luigi Gaetti, who is here with us, and the other distinguished guests who have had to leave, the representatives of the National Order of Journalists. I hope I have observed all the protocols. Congratulations to Italy, because this is one of the first events in Europe, probably in the world, in the build-up to the 2nd of November, which is International Day to End Impunity. As you know, the General Assembly declared this day because they saw how important this day is. As we know, in Italy, you are fortunate because you have not had journalists murdered in the past recent years. This is a result of the intensive work of prevention and protection that has been a cooperation of the judiciary, the security forces, the Ministry of the Interior, members of the media, and members of civil society, such as the Ossigeno. I'm aware of this model also because last week it was presented in Vienna by the chief anti-mafia and anti-terrorism prosecutor, Mr. Cafiero de Rao. He was presenting it at the UN Conference of Parties of the Convention Against Organized Crime. So I think Italy has shown it can lead in this regard. Indeed, also the monitoring mechanism and the method that is used by Mr. Spampinato and his team is also something that leads the world. And the fact today that we are here in this building of the Senate shows the engagement of the Italian democracy to guarantee a free and safe press. The safety of journalists is an issue that should go beyond the political differences. It is a universal prerequisite. But as I said, although Italy has not had the killings of journalists in recent years, around the world we know that this specter is on the march. According to UNESCO's figures, last year, 80 murders of journalists were recorded by UNESCO, and more than half of those 80 were not in war zones, but in countries where there's not armed conflict. Of course, we all know the cases of the 3 journalists killed in Europe in recent years. This is a price we cannot afford to pay. Could I show the first slide, please, here? Each year, 1 journalist gets a Pulitzer Prize and 100 get shot. The killings of journalists are the worst kind of crime against the media workers, but of course we should keep in mind the other kinds of crimes, because although most journalists are not murdered, very many are subjected to other kinds of illegal attacks, from assault, as we heard, through to emotional terror, such as that monitored by the Ossigeno. Women journalists are especially the subject of hate-filled harassment that is intended to bully women into submission and self-censorship. I could recommend next year that if you repeat this, you should have a woman journalist on the panel, because we have an all-male panel. And a woman journalist could give testimony what it is like specifically to get the harassment as a woman journalist. As you know, the main message of Impunity Day is to call for justice. The states have the duty to uphold the rule of law in the cases of journalists who are killed or subject to other kinds of attacks. Now, we can see that the states need to do better here, because if you look at the report of the UNESCO Director General, now, as you heard, more than 1,000 journalists were killed in the last 10 years. Now, this year already, 80 journalists have been killed. That is 1 journalist on average killed every 4 days. You can guess how many of these cases have been resolved worldwide. It is 11%. So impunity for these crimes goes hand in hand with the crimes. Now, at UNESCO, we do not have statistics on impunity for the non-fatal attacks, the kind of attacks that are monitored here in Italy. But we have no reason to think impunity is less bad with the non-fatal attacks than with the fatal attacks. So the point is that the states have the obligation to end impunity for killings and for these other acts, and they need to give much more attention to this. Now, to fulfill the obligation, the states need information about the range of attacks and the range of impunity in their jurisdiction. Now, you might be interested to know that Italy, amongst all the other countries of the world, agreed to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And those goals, which are relevant not just to developing countries, but to Italy, to all developed countries as well, these goals, the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, they include, is there a reduction of all forms of violence? Is there the rule of law? And is there public access to information and fundamental freedom? If you want to measure the goal on public access to information and fundamental freedom, the UN has suggested that you could see, is there a reduction in the cases of killings, kidnappings, arbitrary detention, torture, and other harmful acts against the journalists? Now, just last month, the Human Rights Council in Geneva passed a resolution encouraging states to monitor this indicator. In other words, is there a reduction in the number of cases of killings, arbitrary detention, and other harmful acts? UNESCO also, it's 195 member states, in December called for national monitoring in each country because we have to count and record these attacks. If a society is able to understand, is it making progress or not on the killings and on impunity? Could we have the next slide, which says more than 100 journalists have been, no, sorry, you'll be too far ahead. If you go back. Yes, more than 100 journalists have been killed to make this advert. The statistics sound like statistics, but if we do not have statistics, we cannot see if the society is going down or moving forward or staying in the same place. The point is that a society that does not monitor and understand the crimes against journalists, they will lack the means to stop these attacks. This is why the Council of Europe monitoring platform is important. It's why the work of Ossigeno is important. It's why the monitoring and the survey of the AGICOM is important. One question that has been raised, can Italy do more, especially officially, for monitoring, analyzing, and action based on results? UNESCO is not here to say what you should do, but we suggest you discuss this participatively, bringing the media, the professionals, the civil society, and the various parts of the state, the government, the independent judiciary, and the legislators. Yes, it costs money if the state sets a monitoring mechanism, but think about the cost if that monitoring is not happening. That cost is far greater. A number of states have responded to this call by the UN, and they have created official monitoring bodies. If that's appropriate to Italy, it's for you to discuss. What is clear, of course, is that if states cannot understand and cannot halt the attacks on journalists, then the situation will get worse. We will lose information that is vital to have accountable democracy and a corruption-free development. Attacks, whether they are physical, whether they are psychological, or whether they are digital, these create a spiral of silence. And when you have a vacuum of verifiable facts and evidence-based arguments because of the silencing and intimidation of journalists, then what happens? What happens is there's a vacuum and the lies, the cover-ups, the rumor, and the propaganda come in to fill the gap. We can say the garden of information becomes overgrown with the weeds of disinformation and misinformation. This is why the safety of journalists is all the more important today in this context. Can we have the next slide, which shows the 3 Ps? It's well known that for journalists to practice their profession safely, societies need to mobilize on these 3 Ps. I think we all know about the protection, we know about the prosecution, so I say a few words on prevention, because the prevention, of course, is better than trying to cure the problem. The more you prevent, the less work you have to do previously. So 3 points quickly to make. The one is the global climate on prevention. Second one is the national climate. And third one, the legal situation. So in terms of prevention, the global climate, If you look at UN resolutions on safety, do you know that 11 resolutions were made in the UN, in Geneva, New York, both Security Council and General Assembly, and in Paris at UNESCO. 11 resolutions in 5 years on this subject. It shows that the public opinion is internationally very strong on this question. Italy has supported all these resolutions, so congratulations to you. Your country has sponsored where it is a member of that body. That's about the global climate. Of course it can change, but that is the achievement of the past 5 years. Then you come to the national climate for prevention. Now here, we know that the media should never be sacred and above criticism. At the same time, when there is very harsh political rhetoric, this lowers the threshold so that gangsters can decide then to commit actual crimes because the climate is such that journalists are treated as scoundrels, as malicious elements. So I think in terms of this, it becomes very important that we do not have a climate, a national climate, which leads to aggressors thinking it is acceptable to make death threats against individuals, to bomb their officers, to abduct them, and even to murder them. The Human Rights Council in Geneva that I mentioned recently, they expressed alarm, and I quote, they say, "At cases where political leaders, public officials, or authorities denigrate, intimidate, or threaten the media, including individual journalists, because this increases the risk of threats and violence against journalists." And the Human Rights Council calls for the political actors to think carefully in terms of their rhetoric and to restrain themselves. So I covered the global climate, UN resolutions, then the national climate with the rhetoric about the media, and then we come to the legal situation. How is journalism considered in terms of the law? So when a society has defamation as a criminal matter, a criminal offense, as distinct from a civil law matter, then there is a risk that journalistic expression is put in the same category as basic criminality. So journalistic expression can be lumped together with criminals who commit violent crimes against journalists. However, it is evident that where there are cases of defamation that lack any justification of truth and public interest, then for those cases there also exist many redress measures that are alternative to criminalization, and particularly alternatives to imprisonment. Could we have the next slide, please? The murder of journalists is always bad news, even for those who are behind it. And for this, I want to add another P to the list of the 3 Ps. The P of people, because people have to push back against the onslaught. People includes the media actors, because they have such an important role. Too often, journalists are not reporting on the attacks about journalists, and too often they do not come forward and register these attacks with the police. Journalists have a role to play as people in pushing for their own safety. Of course, journalists should also practice the highest standards of journalism so the public can really appreciate and cherish the role that the journalists play and to help defend them. Then other actors amongst the people, the political leaders, the judges, the NGOs, the academics, they also have a key part to play as part of the people. So if we say there's a package of 4 Ps of the prevention, the protection, the prosecution, and the people, yes, this is ambitious. Yes, it is extensive. But if we want a world that is safe for journalists, we need all these 4. Because only in that way can we have journalists telling us about issues and opinions that are unpopular with some quarters. For example, issues such as corruption, lying, disinformation campaigns, domestic violence, racism, xenophobia, and so on. For UNESCO this year, the Impunity Day, we have a certain theme focusing on the role of people. Now, usually when journalists are killed, their stories are also killed. But it's important to send a message to the attackers that their efforts will be futile. So UNESCO has the hashtag Truth Never Dies. Truth never dies. We're encouraging people, that is the public, the journalists, the politicians, to keep alive the projects of those journalists who are assassinated or intimidated. Because if we can do this, we undercut and remove the incentive of those committing the attacks. And UNESCO will commend in this regard the strong support of the Italian journalists for the project called Forbidden Stories that seeks to continue the work of Daphne Caruana Galizia. Let me begin to wind up now by saying that truth cannot be allowed to die, but when leaders are silent in the face of killings and other attacks on journalists, this can be taken as consent by those who commit such atrocities. It can contribute to oblivion, which is the aim of these attacks. Now, the recent Human Rights Council called on governments to publicly, unequivocally, and systematically condemn violence, intimidation, threats, and attacks on journalists and media workers. It's imperative that the leaders do condemn in the strongest terms all attacks on journalists, indicating as well that crimes like these will not be successful in achieving their censorship objective. In closing, and taking note of our venue and the city where this important event is being held, I want to propose a wider perspective on the issue of safety. Let us recall here the battles for free speech by the philosophers in the ancient Rome, sometimes at the cost of their lives. Journalism today is one of the most valuable components of human heritage, and as you know, UNESCO is a body dedicated to preserve heritage. Like other heritages, we have to protect and defend this heritage of journalism. But this heritage is endangered when criminals, in order to cover up their crimes, then commit further crimes directly against the media practitioners. And journalism is doubly endangered when these crimes are committed with impunity. So we need people to push back against the purpose of attacks by pursuing the stories of those who were silenced, by speaking out strongly in the case of the harassment or killings, and by pursuing justice for the victims. In this way, we can secure journalism as a heritage that is a practice of information free from fear. That's why, with these 4 Ps, we need the people to stand up and push back today. And the last slide, please. When a journalist is murdered, we can have a moment of silence, or we can make a lot of noise. Thank you.
Veniva in mente queste suggestioni, queste cose molto belle, molto profonde di Guy, ma non so, è inaudi decidere, conoscere per decidere, per deliberare, o John Milton, ma siamo nel 1644, il problema della verità, della libertà di stampa. E grazie a Berger. Io adesso darei la parola al sottosegretario all'interno Luigi Gaetti. L'onorevole Gaetti ha maturato, questo sentirete anche, immagino, dal suo discorso, che non conosco naturalmente, ha maturato una importante esperienza nella passata legislatura come vicepresidente della Commissione antimafia, che ha prodotto la Commissione antimafia dei rapporti sullo stato del giornalismo, avanzando anche proposte di cui stiamo discutendo oggi di grande impegno, ed è sottosegretario all'interno proprio con deleghe riferite a questo settore. Intanto che do la parola al sottosegretario Gaetti, inviterei a scaldare l'ugola il professor Mario Morcellini, che è commissario Agicomi, a raggiungerci qui al nostro tavolo, e la stessa cosa chiederei a Nadia Monetti. Nadia, vuoi venire qui da noi, che ed è membro, componente del comitato esecutivo dell'Ordine Nazionale dei Giornalisti, che è l'altro ente grazie al quale possiamo organizzare questi convegni internazionali. Mi scusi, sottosegretario? Prego, poi me la restituisce la parola.
I'm sorry, my microphone was off. Anyway, he just introduced the following speakers. I'm sorry.
Grazie. No, grazie davvero.
Thank you for inviting me here today. As the speaker just said, I was part of this anti-mafia committee on mafia and journalism. So I will be only referring to the specific sector. In many cases, reporters have been threatened because they were investigating in mafia-related issues. It was a very enriching experience for me because I got familiar with a very highly complex issue. Reporters can communicate and give information, and very often they gather these pieces of information and then they pass on the message through the media. And as Senator Crimi rightly said, people who, the reporters really need to be protected. Therefore, their role is extremely important, not only as information providers, but also because they have to stimulate a general debate when it comes to mafia. I come from northern Italy. I come from Mantova. Northern Italy, there's never been a real debate on mafia, except for a few journalists who have started pointing out these problems, and most of these reporters today are under police protection. We really have to hold on to this approach. There's another point I would like to draw your attention on, and this was only partially mentioned this morning, and that is the following. If we really want a full-fledged freedom, we need to acknowledge the role of reporters. When I see these young reporters writing important articles, they highlight sensitivities. They are paid very little money, and they give a major contribution to the judiciary, and they are not really given 100% freedom. And I think that we should be very careful about this. We need to address the requirements of these young reporters. And then, as Crimi was saying, we also have the problem with the publishers, because reporters can have an influence. There's no doubt about this. But 99% of cases, they do have a positive influence, but not only do we need to provide them with adequate judicial protection, but also money-wise. We were saying that these young reporters get very little money for what they do, and I think that this is very important. I mean, you cannot be free. Allow me to say, our citizen citizenship means the following: we cannot be free unless we have a dignified life. Well, the risk here in a minor percentage of cases, but we see that there are other cases where some reporters, instead of being people who actually provide biased information on one hand, were on the wrong side. So by this I mean we have to be very careful. We have to be careful when it comes to ethics. I'm a physician, and of course ethics is very important for me, and it is not easy to make an adequate assessment when it comes to ethics. So I don't know what the solution is. But what I want to say is that ethics is a very important issue, but I'm not sure how we can assess it. One other important point is preventive censorship. And by this I mean, unless the reporter is given free rein when it comes to expressing his ideas, then he is limited in expressing himself. And this goes to the detriment of free information, which I believe is essential, because unless we have free information, we cannot speak about growth, growth for society. Thank you.
Grazie onorevole.
Dignity. This is a word that comes to my mind when I think about reporters. Reporters who carry out this democratic role. I will give the floor to Morcellini, but I would like to ask Michela Banese, who represents the Federation of the Press. I will better explain what this means. Professor Morcellini, we all know him very well here. So we don't need to introduce him to our audience. He is an expert in sociology, in communication technology, and now he is a member of the Commission of Agicom. He is a scholar, a distinguished scholar, and you have the floor. I have been studying this sector 40 years now, and I've been in Agicom with Agicom for 1.5 years. But when it comes to communication, well, if I see what we actually are going through today, this leads to no optimism. But we need to try and identify appropriate sources, psychological sources, moral sources. I would like to tie in what the previous speaker just said. He has this journal. The title of the journal is Civil Liberties, and it's a very interesting journal. We have this review. There's another review in the Ministry of the Interior, which makes surveys on immigration. Now, so if we want to have a different look at this issue, for instance, the report on mafia information, for instance, a very interesting report. There are a number of sensitivities, attacks to freedom, harassment, and of course, they too are a form of a limit to one's freedom. And then there's a number of things that have to be addressed. But if you think of it, the word Ossigeno is encapsulating all of these ideas. This is why I like this title, because it makes me think of all the threats. There's no such thing as one single threat, but the threat is imbued within the cultural and environment of today. Because this is what we're talking about, that is reducing the vitamins of democracy, participation, commitment. This is a very nice room, but just if you think about how many people are here today, are we talking about an adequate force unless we do something more, something that may be turned into something viral, which could be all-embracing. And I promise I will be very brief. My presentation will only be 15 minutes long. So The first point I would like to stress is the present cultural environment. Even though it's not easy to give it a clear-cut definition, because of course it is an ever-evolving environment. And there are so many things that can affect your own identity. So the cultural environment. The cultural environment is what you're actually sharing with your own environment. So this environment has been under attack by a number of different sources, and they were all under, which were defined by Crimi in the following way. Well, of course, he has tried to give a contribution to this environment. But if we get the interpretation wrong, then we cannot set the appropriate priorities. The source of attack is essential. And then the second point is of all the things that should be done, which things really depend on our own action. I'm not sure if the acoustics is working well here. Apologies for that. I would like to join with what Crimi just said now. First of all, the industrial crisis. The industrial crisis. Well, the first crisis was not an industrial crisis. The first crisis is something which is hard to identify, which is the failure to have a value in the products, information products that we are actually delivering as of today. And let me add this at the following. Digital media has given a final blow to the perceived value of information as an asset in contemporary society. We no longer have the same interpretation of information that young people have. Because what Agicom should do is to convey a message to the young generation. And I must say that we have been lagging behind in this connection. By this I mean we have to develop a strategy where the youth are one of the priorities. So hence this have to change the way we approach the value of information. So as opposed to the part, these products of information are no longer providing the value they used to provide in the past. And this was mentioned by Crimi, and Agicom is very serious about this. If you really want to talk about freedom of expression, if you really want to test this out, then you have to what the precariousness of journalism, because we can no longer talk about the precariousness of journalism in a superficial manner. We can say that precariousness is an endemic damage because it finally totally destroys the moral value of people. How can we say to a young reporter that he has to be independent as opposed to the economic forces and the authorities which are prevailing in our society? So, and this brings me back to this cultural environment I was referring to before. So, and by this I mean we have to refer to what we call common assets and the way we interpret these common assets. When it comes to common assets, if there are common assets or common goods, they really have to be shared, something around which we have to pool our forces and have developed synergies. Because when it comes to journalism, we really have to, we need to share forces. So we have to be very clear on this concept of losing the real value of information, because we have to be aware about this. I have no time to elaborate on this, but on November 23rd, Agicom will celebrate its 20-year activity, and on this occasion, we will have a meeting on Friday, November the 23rd. We'll have this day as journalism in the society of disinformation. I made this very brief digression, but let me go back to my original issue. Why is it so that young reporters are not valuing this information as in the past? And this also leads to this important phenomenon of providing information through the net. Journalism cannot do without mediation. It cannot become a mediation-less form of information. So we must not give up this idea of having a mediation when it comes to providing information. We've developed a cultural structure. Structure based on ethics, and this is something that has to be very resilient against these new phenomena. So, and I come to my concluding remarks. There's one point I would like to call your attention on, and that is the indulgence that we tend to have when it comes to Italian professional journalism, because we have to acknowledge this, and by this I mean the Italian journalism has been negligent when it comes to developing a cultural environment whereby there is a overwhelmingly exaggerated attention on the migration-related issues. In Italy, people believe that there is an over 50% increase of the number of migrants, and these migrants are not just coming out of the blue. This was not said by the Providence, but this is something which has come through a too lazy communication means, which has become too lazy in the way they interpret the change in our environment. And so when it comes to crime reporting, migrants are perfectly fitting in describing these phenomena. So I think it comes finally to the way we interpret these phenomena. So even when it comes to politics has not efficiently interpreted these new changes. And they've been interpreting it by slogan, and this is a way of downgrading the interpretations. So there is a excessive attention on the society of the single individual, because if we overwhelmingly interpret these events, we have a skewed picture of this, of the scenario of society today. So if this is only partly true, we have to say that we cannot simply think that we can address the issue by exchanging data and information, because this is the offspring of a climate of fear and intimidation. So no political change is possible unless the world of politics follows a humbled approach when it comes to addressing this issue. So politicians have to actively participating in redefining contemporary society. So what can we do? And well, first of all, we need to raise awareness to have the digital journalism become one of the essential elements of the Italian school. Italian school system is doing its utmost, but there's no doubt that when it comes to teaching, even though I think it's a very interesting system, we are not setting up a real dialogue with the young students. So I think that in the school system, we need to include digital technology, because digital technology is essential when it comes to communication. So if in the Italian school system we include a media education program, now curriculum. So Agicom has taken up this initiative, and other organizations likewise have done so. I think the Ministry of Education should do the same, especially in the primary school years of students. So we need to get the students more thoroughly prepared when it comes to media education. They need to become more aware about the importance of journalism, and this would change the way they develop their culture and the way they think of citizenship. And second point is the following. Journalism is going through a very deep crisis, and therefore I think that we must study more. Education has to be enhanced, training. There was this book written by Bardazzi, and in this book he talks about the dialogue between American reviews and the Italian academic environment. It is very important to develop this cooperation. We do have some instances in the cooperation in Italy between region and local schools, but we have to develop this common asset, which is information. No society can give up information unless they publicly say so. I think that we should have a kind of a public statement that there are some non-negotiable assets. If we really want to be a modern society, this is what it's all about. We have to be aware about the importance of the tradition and then adjust the tradition to modern society. So we need to improve this activity. And I think that Agicom is a point of excellence when it comes to data collection and analysis. And it's not by pure chance that if we decided to hold a workshop on journalism and this society of disinformation in celebrating a 20-year activity, because we need to be aware that this is all up to us. It depends on the content of information that we are providing. Modernity does not necessarily mean that we are multiplying fake news. These are all mechanisms that have to be identified and monitored. But of course, this also calls for social and cultural initiatives. The internet does not have to turn into obsolescence the information as asset. If we give up information, then we give up being citizens, we give up being adults. And the very final comment I would like to make is that if you just close your eyes, there's a tendency to be more pessimistic than optimistic when it comes to criticism. We cannot afford this luxury of pessimism, because if pessimism takes over, then we will be held accountable towards the young generation. And so, by this I mean that the young generation, I mean, we must pass on to the young generation psychological resources and this cultural legacy which we owe to the young generation. They need to have a cultural legacy which is what has made our life so strong. So pessimism is banned from the Italian school system. And I would like to conclude by referring to this poem of Oderling. He was a German poet. He certainly had no reason to be to be optimistic. He saw this flower blooming in the abyss, and objects, of course, are turned into metaphors when it comes to poems. He thinks that this flower is blooming to help those who fall in the abyss. But the way he is phrasing it is far better than what I'm saying. But this is exactly the message I want to convey to you all. Where the danger is at its highest, there's always somewhere something that is blooming, and that will save us all. Thank you.
Grazie, professore. Mi ha ricordato.
Thank you, Professor. You reminded me of Martin Heidegger. When you are on the brink of the abyss, then you can be saved. Thank you for all you said, especially when you mentioned training. In December, we will meet the schools of journalism and communication in Palermo at the university, where we will meet and exchange ideas. I'm afraid we're very late. I'll give the floor to Michele Albanese. Michele represents the National Federation of the Italian Press, and his remit is legality. Michele Albanese, because of the work he carries out in Calabria, lives under police escort. Thank you for coming. Michele. I called him Mario, but actually he's Michele.
Intanto vi ringrazio, sarò brevissimo.
I will be very, very. I'd like to thank Ossigeno for all it does. It's a personal acknowledgement, but I'm also speaking on behalf of the Italian National Press Federation. Thank you for all the things you do, your study of the situation and all, which supports us in our activity. I was wondering, what am I going to say this morning? There's a personal and human dimension that cannot be neglected when we speak about attacks to the freedom of the press. Wherever I walk, I'm followed by a gun or by explosives. I've been living under escort for some years. I've been told that I'm still in danger, and therefore I live with this ghost. It's not so much a matter of impunity, because in my region, there's a weird rationale. When somebody who's on the run is captured, another one comes in. And of course, it's something you have to learn and live with. Danger, loneliness, a non-life almost, because I always live in a state of tension while at the same time trying to do my job. I'm saying this with a great sense of responsibility. In my case, things are not clear yet. I'm still in danger, but of course the institutions are not responsible. I think that I owe to them the fact that I'm alive, because thanks to the investigations of the police, my life has been saved. Without those investigations, anything could have happened. My experience led me to do what I do within the National Press Federation with great discretion. I don't want to be famous. I want to put my experience at the service of my profession, of the union, of associations, defending the freedom of the press. The Undersecretary said that there is a feeling that our world has been somehow infected by criminality. He mentioned the Emilia inquiry, but there are other similar cases in our country, and we're trying to work on this as well. However, I'd like to say something in particular. I think of what the professor was saying, but I was sort of afraid, because if I think of how much in the world, in Europe, in Italy, we are under attack. Think of the relationships between politics and information in America, in South America, in Malta, Slovenia, Saudi Arabia. Colleagues who died, colleagues who are squeezed by environments where mediation does not exist. In the world, there are too many powers wanting to remove the central role of information. Information is successful when it mediates, when it informs as many people as possible about the pros and cons of the contexts they describe. Without mediation, there's no journalism. In our case, in my case, and in the case of many colleagues who live under escort and who are threatened, Well, that happened because that's what they have been trying to do, mediate, explain, analyze certain situations. And very often, thanks to journalism, some dangers were explained. I mean, journalists did it even before the government. The danger of living in certain areas of the country has been made known by journalists. And that's why I'm so worried about the political and institutional decisions whereby there's an attempt to stifle this role of mediation. There is an increasing number of cases where journalists are seen as enemies. They cannot play that mediation roles. They cannot describe situations, contexts, carry out analysis, wave red flags, because there's an intention to get to a direct contact between institutions and citizens. And this is not the reflection of a real social civil society. Considering my experience, I've always been aware of the fact that there were some circles against which I could have found myself. But this should not be underestimated, and there are some circles which underestimate this and try to underplay the role of journalists. Journalism is journalism if it plays for democracy, if it monitors politics, powers, and the mafia, so creating the conditions that are necessary for everything positive to grow, democracy and freedom. And that's what we're doing with our federation, together with the professional orders. And I wish that this debate may continue. I would have wanted Senator Crimi to remain to remind him that yes, of course, there is job insecurity for journalism, but it is also true that job insecurity cannot be fought by deleting funds for the publishing of regional papers, who are the basis for informing local citizens. Let's be clear, our world of course, has responsibilities. We need to become credible again, to be impartial again, and to feel responsible because of the role that we're supposed to play. But there are contradictions. We cannot say that we are so good because we fight against job insecurity and then approve initiatives that stifle all the forms of mediation and struggle against illegality, which does not only mean crime, because there is a sort of connection between crime and other powers. The money that people say stinks does not stink because, well, money never stinks. This kind of information, investigative journalism and good journalism should be helped to thrive. And thank you, Ossigeno.
Grazie, Michele. Il tempo stringe, non so se ce la facciamo. Vabbè, vi invito a...
We don't have a lot of time. I'd like to ask the comic speakers, 5 of them, to be brief. Nadia Monetti represents the National Order of Journalists. She's a member of the Executive Committee. Francesca Montagna, the Council of Europe, are you ready? Will you come here?
Vado? Sì, allora, buongiorno, parole importanti.
Good morning. We have just listened to a very interesting speech by Michele Albanese. First of all, I would like to send the best regards of Carlo Verna, who unfortunately couldn't make it here today. He is in Bologna, working on a very important project. And here's but we talked today about a very interesting issue, reporters under threat, sued and unfortunately killed, and very often these crimes go unpunished. The data are extremely concerning. So this is a subject that the Order of Journalists has addressed, and we have organized a number of initiatives. Now, the basic question is the following. Well, no citizen should ever be threatened anyhow, but when you threaten a reporter, you threaten the right of the citizen to be fairly informed. In our guidelines of the reform of the Order of Journalists, which have been approved a few days ago, the Order of Journalists has been redefined Order of Journalism, not of journalists. This is to stress the function and not the person in itself. So the union, together with the association and Ossigeno, the Catholic environment, we support a new project. We want to protect reporters and citizens. And we will refer to what is referred to as media escort. And I refer to reporters who are under threat. We don't want to leave them alone, but whereabouts, everywhere, in the street, and in any place. Mafia kills and silence too kills. This is what the Undersecretary Crimi just said. Yes, it is true indeed. Silence kills too. This is one thing that organized crime doesn't like, and that is people shed light on their crimes. And this is what reporters are doing, putting their life at risk. Hence, the media escort has to be developed because we don't want to leave these reporters alone. We keep going through the list of reporters, colleagues like Paolo Borrometi, who has been threatened to death by mafia people, Federica Batti, who has been threatened together with her family. So these are well-known events. We have all expressed our support to these reporters. We support them judicially speaking because we want to be always standing by their side. And there are 19 or 20 reporters who are under police protection. And this is totally unacceptable, like Michele Albanese was just saying. So if we are referring to these colleagues, it's because we don't want to have heroes who are shedding light on crimes. This is something that other people should do, because if you're looking for heroes, this means that the society is taking a step back, and it is up to the single citizen to report these events. So when we shed light on these crimes thanks to a reporter, then we say we must not turn our back to these events, but rather we should respond to it. So by media escort, I refer to something which applies across the board. So this applies also to all those who want to uphold the rights for freedom. Remember the case of Roxy Bar, where the owners reported aggressors who had beaten up a disabled. Well, they have been brought to justice, and that was belonged to the Casamonica family. So journalists and reporters have expressed their sympathy to this very brave family. The perpetrators have been brought to justice, but now once a week these people go to Roxy Bar just for a coffee. We call it the coffee of legitimacy and lawfulness. Just to say that these people are not alone. And these people, by the way, were not Italian. They were from Romania. And Romania. So I know time is running up, but we have already talked about other instances. But when it comes to media escort, I would like to talk about threats. Well, if you report to the police what is going on, you go through an ordeal because first of all, people will think that you are making it up, but then you are totally isolated, and then when you're alone, you're under attack. So this is what we have to fight against, this process. We have to stand united in fighting all of this. Thank you.
Più breve di così.
Volevo dire grazie per la...
Thank you for having been so brief. Anyway, we will publish Nadia's contribution and all the other contributions. Thank you, Nadia. Francesca Montagna, representing the Council of Europe. Mrs. Montagna works in the director concerned with the application of the Council's resolution for the safety of journalists. And then I'd like to ask Lutz Kinkel to come here with Paola Spadari.
Allora, buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning. My name is Francesca Montagna. I work for the media department at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. The Council of Europe was founded in 1949. It includes 47 members, and its mandate is to promote and protect human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And of course, the European Court for Human Rights is part of the Council of Europe. It's the judicial body established by the Convention on Human Rights. And its judgments are binding for member states. I will summarize my contribution. Statistics are very clear. It shows that there's a decrease in the protection of journalists in the member countries of the Council of Europe. Many journalists were killed, and the murders of the previous years were unpunished. The Platform for the Protection of Journalism and the Safety of Journalists, it's a platform of the Council of Europe, registered 126 cases of detention of journalists and 128 cases of threats and harassment. The most serious incidents, L1, have increased to 48%. The reversal of this trend is one of our priorities. To this purpose, we use a set of tools. First of all, the case law of the European Court on Human Rights about security and protection of journalists, including judgments on the violation of rights to the freedom of expression, right to life and family life. Moreover, the Committee of Ministers, who is the decision-making body of the Council, issues non-binding standards. The most important of these standards is the one that was mentioned today, the recommendation of 2016 on the protection of journalism and the safety of journalists and the other media actors. This recommendation is a milestone. It is the first international instrument which provides governments with exhaustive guidelines on how to better create an environment where public debate can take place and with specific measures to protect journalists. Prevention, protection, prosecution, and awareness raising. The Council of Europe also implements its own standards and the European Convention on Human Rights with another set of instruments. An alert mechanism through its platform for the promotion of the protection of journalism and the safety of journalists, assistance to member countries to check the consistency of bills with the Council of Europe standard, international cooperation with member countries, seminars, training, legal advice, and implementation plans and recommendations. And then the judgments of the European Court Human Rights and studies and legal analysis on the challenges and trends in the area of the freedom of expression. Regarding the platform in particular, it is an early alert and response mechanism when the freedom of the media or the safety of journalists are seriously attacked. The cases are pointed out by organizations which have an agreement with the Council of Europe. Attacks to the personal safety, incarceration, harassment and intimidation, impunity, and other serious effects which deter freedom of expression. In these cases, the Council can act swiftly in coordination with other international organizations, thus identifying emerging problems and developing proposals on rules or political activity, and start a dialogue with the countries concerned. After 2015, we received 480 cases of information, many of them from member countries. 23 journalists we got information that 23 journalists had been killed. Would like to mention the Dink case against Turkey, a case where a journalist was murdered, a journalist that had been the victim of ultranationalists as a result of articles on the relations with the Turkish population and Armenian Turkish population. Article 2 was deemed to have been violated, the right to life, and a right on which no interference should be tolerated, and actually the life of an individual should be protected when there is an imminent and real threat. This obligation exists also on the basis of Article 10, freedom of expression. Therefore, in order to protect the right to freedom of expression, it may be necessary to adopt protective measures. It is also necessary to create an environment where everybody may be encouraged to take part in public debates so that everybody may express his or her opinion without any fear. These positive obligations under Article 2, but also under Article 10, freedom of expression, and 3, prevention of torture, also have a procedural aspect. According to these articles, the government must ensure an effective, independent, and timely investigation. In the Mazeba versus Russia case, even though the defendants for the murder of Anna Politkovskaya had been identified, the investigation was not deemed to have been effective because it did not consider who was the actual principal in that murder. Then the recommendation on the protection of journalism and the safety of journalists and other media players is based on the case law of the court. Therefore, it is divided in 4 categories: prevention, identifies the characteristics of a legislative framework guaranteeing freedom of expression and proposes a periodical revision of legislation by an independent body to ensure that all necessary guarantees are there, and to ensure that laws on national security against terrorism and regulations against libel are not applied in a discriminatory way. Protection, early alert and response methods, police, judges should be informed on the role of journalists in society, consistent with the case law of the European Court. Regarding prosecution, we specify the requirements for an effective prosecution, and we also advise to set up specialized units aware of the rights of human rights, abolish prescription, and promote judicial or non-judicial investigations by specialized bodies when investigations and criminal action do not lead to the sentencing of the guilty parties. We don't have time, as you said earlier, and therefore I will conclude here. We are working on the implementation of this recommendation, which sets forth a number of activities, including training, the specification of the recommendation, and the collection of best practices. I'd like to ask Italian authorities to please translate this recommendation, which in our opinion is very useful, and if possible, develop national plans dealing with the protection of journalists and the safety of journalists.
Grazie a Francesca Mota. Io vorrei ricordare che
Yes. Lala Orlandi is here with us today. She is a member of the European Commission for the media department. And thank you for being here today. And now I will give the floor to Lutz Kitzel, who is a German reporter. He is at the European Center for the Freedom of the Press and of the Media. Ossigeno is a partner with this non-profit association based in Lipsia, and you have the floor, sir. Apologies for asking you to be brief.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this invitation. My name is Lutz Kinkel. I'm the managing director of the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, which is located in Leipzig. Probably you know Leipzig, which is in East Germany and which is not far away from Berlin. We have a couple of instruments that answer threats on journalists. I just want to mention 2 of them. One is the Journalists in Residence program. You can apply for being a journalist in residence in Leipzig, and then you stay for half a year in Leipzig, and you get a stipend, which is 1,000 euros a month, and you get free healthcare, and you get a furnished apartment. And well, this is always very impressive, because the people coming to Leipzig and staying for half a year, I mean, they are like completely different persons when they come in and when they get out. You can see the relaxation, you can see the people really recovering, you can see, okay, they have the possibility to simply to work or simply to be without any threat. This is one instrument. The other instrument is Mapping Media Freedom, which is our monitoring system. We do it together with Index on Censorship. And this Mapping Media Freedom is also reporting then to the platform of the Council of Europe. We just heard a few words about that. Ossigeno is our partner from the very beginning, and I must really say I admire the work of Alberto Spampinato. I mean, he dedicated literally his life to protect the lives of others and to end impunity when attacks occur. I have to be brief, so I only want to make two remarks. The one remark is on Malta, and the other remark is on the situation in Germany. Our legal advisor, her name is Flutura Kusari, she comes from Kosovo, and she's a media lawyer, was last week in Malta, exactly 1 year after the death of Daphne Caruana Galizia. As you know, she was killed. No, she was lacerated by a car bomb. 3 suspects have now been arrested, but these 3 suspects have no motive at all whatsoever to kill an investigative journalist. So they are obviously, and they were obviously, just the handymen of the case. But the Maltese authorities don't put an effort into digging deeper. We had a talk, Flutura had a talk with other press media freedom organizations, with the Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, and in this talk he was refusing, as always, a public inquiry. A public inquiry on certain aspects of the case, and of course he was refusing an external, independent investigation into the case. What does it mean? Does it mean impunity for the masterminds behind this cruel murder? I would say this is the most likely result for Malta. Malta, of course, is a very drastic example of what could go wrong. The problem in Malta, as you all know, is corruption, and the problem is hate speech as well. Daphne was insulted as a witch, as a whore, as a lunatic. She, as a journalist, was constructed as an enemy. And you know, this phenomena, the concept of an enemy called journalists, is highly dangerous because it delivers the justification for violence. And this is not only the case in Malta, it's also the case in my home country, Germany. Probably you heard of the right-wing protesters in Chemnitz and in Köthen, and we as the ECPMF afterwards, we decided, okay, we have to investigate the cases, and we have to check the cases, and we have to check the assaults. It turned out that we had 22 assaults this year from January to September. One of the assaults, the background is unclear, nobody knows exactly why it happened. The other assault happened in the Hambacher Forst. Obviously it was conducted by left-wing extremists. They tried to defend this forest against a company which wants to implement a coal mine there. But 20 out of 22 assaults happened during right-wing events and right-wing protests. So there is a clear political context. These right-wing protesters in Germany, they scream Lügenpresse, Lügenpresse, which is in English, well, you can hardly translate it because it's an old and ugly German word. It means lying press, lying press. Because they think journalists hide the truth about migration. Their truth is migration is the cause for every problem, and maybe also for the climate change. And anybody who disagrees is, of course, a liar. Maybe he's not only a liar, but he's a traitor. And if you say the journalist is a traitor, then you say this journalist deserves to be attacked. This is the mechanism behind it. the numbers of attacks in Germany go up, and the police is obviously not capable to safeguard journalists and to protect them sufficiently. One of the reasons is that they simply don't know how to handle this situation, and they simply don't know the laws. They don't know why they should protect, especially journalists. For us, it is clear because, well, they fulfill a certain function. Everybody wants to know what is happening on these demonstrations, but lots of policemen are not aware of that. My organization, the ECPMF, is offering trainings now, also for the German police, and we will present a code of conduct for the a European code of conduct for the police, how to handle the situation with media. This is just a small step, but this is also one step to end impunity, to train the police and make them partners of journalists. Respect for the law and freedom of debate, this is what we are seeking, this is why we are here. Thank you.
Grazie Lutz.
Thank you very much. Yeah, training of the police forces in this area is a very interesting idea. We will now conclude. I'd like to ask Paola Spadari, who chairs the Order of Journalists here in Lazio. I cannot tell her to be brief because she is the chairperson. And then Alberto Spampinato will say goodbye. Don't worry, I will just deliver my statement. I will confine myself to say hello, to greet and thank all of you here, in particular our international guests who've made this morning so very productive and interesting. This also, of course, for Italian guests, applies to professional development. I'd like to stress that, as Alberto Spampinato said, things have changed for the best. The media somehow helped, the attention of the media somehow helped people to be made aware of the situation. We were in Austria. We went to Austria to support all the colleagues who have been threatened and who are under escort. But I don't think this is enough. We have to keep going, to keep the good work. I was somehow expecting the government to renew its commitment to revitalize the work of the observation post that was established at the Ministry of the Interior during the past legislature, but I don't think I've heard anything about this yet. But today, I think rather than raising the awareness of our colleagues, we should everybody know that our work should be aimed at ordinary citizens. They should be made aware. They should understand the value and importance of information. If they understand that, it might be easier to put an end to this, to these very difficult times. Citizens must be with us, and we should not give up the idea of letting them understand how important information is, not just for us, but for everybody. If we had regular citizens and who are not professionals here, it would be great because they would understand why we're here and what we are defending. We're not defending an elite or privileges. We're defending a value that is important for all of us, first of all, as citizens of this country. If the President of the Republic in a month and a half made 3 different statements in favor of the freedom of the press, well, that certainly means something. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank him publicly, and thank you all for coming here. Have a good afternoon. Thank you, Paola. Since I listened to everything with great attention, I'd like to say this was a very good, very positive morning. I understand it's been long, maybe tiring, but once we put all the material together, we'll be able to see that very interesting things came from very different sources. You will see all the information on our site. Please, Alberto.
I would like to thank you all for having come to this meeting. I would like to thank guys who came from Paris, Brussels, to share with us this ideas and thoughts about this topic. I will be very brief, so I just wanted to say goodbye, and all the major highlights of this debate have been identified. We'll be sharing these reports through the website. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to go through all the papers, and I hope to see you sometime soon in the future. On some other occasions, we'll have another seminar in Brussels on November 6 at the Institute of Culture with Federica Angeli and French and Belgian reporters who have been threatened and who have the same problems we've been talking about this morning. And we are preparing this conference that will be held in Palermo for our 10th anniversary of Ossigeno, just for some food for thought for what lies ahead. Thank you.